So I teach architecture and urban history at Bryn Mawr College, and I teach a course on global landscapes of oil. And so why does that matter? We're talking all about the present and the future here, so why even think about the past? So the one point that I would like to start with is that we have all these energy flows that we're talking about, but they are inscribed and written into tangible forms. And these tangible forms create interdependencies around the globe. And so what does that mean? Before fracking, we might have an image of an American highway here, and then Burj Khalifa. These are two buildings that are in completely different parts of the world, and they may seem completely unrelated. But when we look at the chart, for example, of BP oil and the oil flows, and we inverse these flows from the Middle East to other parts of the country, and this is still from 2009, I believe, that's how these places are interconnected. So what I'm arguing is that we can't really understand the construction even of a building like Burj Khalifa here unless we take into account what's happening at the other ends of the economic spectrum, at the end of the financial exchanges. And so these sites of energy production, exploitation, refining, consumption are intimately related around the world. And once they are established, they can create new patterns. What does that mean? Philadelphia, and we just talked about American oil exports. Philadelphia was the biggest oil exporter port. 50% of American oil went through the port of Philadelphia in the 1890s, and that was lamp oil going for China. Those refineries at the time were established on the Schuylkill. And these refineries have been there for 100 years. In 2011, the company were ready to sell them. They were too old. There was too much environmental disaster going to happen underneath the ground, very difficult to clean up. Bakken came online. These old refineries were revitalized. Why would Philadelphia become another oil city? Just because these infrastructures had been there and had been connected for over 100 years. Oil is again coming in via rail. So these structures, once established, and someone was talking during our conversations today about building an infrastructure maybe for the next 30, 40 years, and then we don't need it anymore. I think that was Kate, right? Here are infrastructures that are really not needed anymore, but they stay in place because they own this land. The trains are going to be coming into that spot. It's all arranged already. So it's as much this connection over space globally and this connection through time that I'm particularly interested in and how it shapes our consumption patterns in the future. So the oil industry has a wide-ranging direct and indirect impact on the built environment. And what do I mean with that? Well, I've tried to sort of map it out. If we have a multinational oil company, often in our conversations here, we've been talking about America or maybe Germany or maybe China. These are all nations, but most of these companies function beyond the national framework. And they can intervene in different parts around the world. So the Dutch oil company in World War II moved to Curaçao when the Germans invaded. So they have no problem getting into other places as need be. They are not just doing oil, they have their influences on national, local governments. They're having a direct influence on production, transportation, and all these things that are listed here. But they also have an indirect impact on other forms of design, on advertisement, on lifestyles, on how we are used to actually living in our cities. And just much prettier than my little chart here is this old graph of Standard Oil and the octopus. Basically, Standard Oil, each of the tentacles reaching for one of the big industries in Pennsylvania or in the United States, including the Capitol, the White House, tying together the infrastructures of extraction to the places of decision-making. At the time, Pennsylvania had the biggest companies in the country, and that's one of the reasons why Philadelphia has this huge city hall. So wealth is physically inscribed into buildings, and these artifacts remain there to remind us of what has happened. And I just said it's also inscribed in many other elements. It's not just the gas stations. All of you are saying probably every other day, oh, turn left at the gas stations. The gas station has become part of our mental map, using Kevin Lynch's terms here. But it's also embedded in the way we live. Why do we have the cities that we have? And there's a lot of advertisement going on, and we were just talking about the ways in which new narratives could be created, in ways in which we could become aware of the global intersections. Well, the 1939 World's Fair already gave us a great example for that. General Motors produced the Futurama, Shell used it for its advertisement, and America's changed its lifestyle, and following the rest of the world, led a oil-dependent, car-driven life. So there's great examples how we can use these kinds of narratives, creations of new memories, intervention into our lifestyle to change the world. The question is, in some ways, whether the current sustainability movement can come together to create just a stronger message and new memories. What I find fascinating, and maybe to point out here, I think post-oil has many facets. We are talking about 5,000 pound life for the United States, but we're also talking about Bakken oil and new oils coming up. So at the same time, we see new construction, we see cleanup activities, we see museums, we see sustainable designs. And often, many of these are still attached to the names of the big oil companies. Just wanted to remind you that Abu Dhabi, Doha, and all these places are using their oil money to create new narratives, new stories. Mazda, zero waste, zero energy cities are going up in that part of the world, at the same time as they are rebranding themselves with global architecture to produce places like Saadiyat Island. We have oil cleanups next door here in Newton Creek, but we also have oil museums. So once again, we are writing this long history of oil into our present common memory. And by the way, Germany had quite a bit of oil. It ran out in the 1950s or so of what it had. And we have a number of oil museums in Germany reminding us of that kind of a tradition. And then there's these kinds of things which fascinate me particularly when you have a LEED certified gas station. So you really continue the dream. And unless we get down to getting all these narratives and stories out of our daily attention, I don't think we can get very far with our transformation in terms of getting something new going. One more point here. We talked briefly about sustainable architecture, eco-cities, low cities, green capitals. There's lots of movements around the world, and they're particularly happening in Europe and America. And often it's a label that's given to a specific, rather limited place. So here I'm showing you Hamburg has a huge new town development that you see outlined in brown there. It wins a Green Capital Award. It has all kinds of prizes, and then we need to get down into the concrete data. It's walkable, multifunctional. It has a primary school. It has different layers of social groups, different types of housing included. So there's lots of urban design ideas that go towards eco-cities that are included. It also hosts the new cruise ships, which are one of the other aspects now coming around. And one cruise ship produces 64,000 cars worth of CO2 when it's docked in a location like that. So we constantly have to question these projects in terms of the numbers that we're actually looking at. So I had thought in terms of the panel to just generate a couple of questions, but maybe also for the audience to think about. So to what degree do these oil-derived environments, and I just tried to give you a little glimpse on that, determine potential future changes? Are we so stoked in oil that can we actually rethink it? If it's a global problem, how can we address it on the local level? How can we address it through bits and pieces of architecture? Does it mean we have to have all single solar homes? How does it work? What are the competing global narratives? And I think your film, Rachel, tells that very nicely. So there's all kinds of different narratives. And if we had this panel in Nigeria or another country, we'd probably get very different stories there. How does the press create a specific narrative about energy. I was been looking in historical journals, and so the Philadelphians and the New Yorkers are fighting it out, and who gets to the oil fields first, and all these reports are there. So there's definitely a story that's being told. So are the sustainable buildings, the eco-cities, all these pinpricks enough to make a change? And how does sustainable energy engage with the larger global networks, which I've tried to point out? So I'm turning it back over to my colleagues here.
Carola, one question. I'm not sure if it's a connection, if you meant the connection, but between, you were showing all those fantastic appropriations of the 1939 World's Fair by oil companies, describing that future growth as being fueled by oil. Do you think it means the opposite, then, that this non-oil future is one of thinking about something other than growth?
That's an interesting point. If you look at the most livable cities today, the ones with most public transportation and so on, many of the shrinking cities of Europe are at the top of it. So that's one question, if it's about shrinkage and the places that are still growing have continued with oil. That could be one part of the question there, definitely.
But isn't the world's population growing at a massive rate? How can you talk about shrinking cities as the solution? I mean, just globally. We're exploding.
You could ask the question, are we not turning oil into food and feeding and creating larger populations? Why didn't the population grow before we had all these resources? So I don't think they're disconnected.
Yeah, but again, I think of Nigeria, and it's very common in Nigeria for people to have twins or triplets or quadruplets, and it happens all the time. And it's I'm sure there are people who know the statistics better than I do, but it's an incredibly dense population and growing by the millisecond. And, I don't think cities, it's a nice idea to think that the solution might be to stop growth, but people have more people who then have more people, and we're growing. I don't see how we realistically.
Well, you're right. And in fact, you find populations tend to stop growing once the average level of wealth increases. So it's a kind of natural consequence of wealth. Birth rates decline. So finally, it's a question about inequality as well, if anything else.
I just want to make sure I understand where you're coming from on this. Are you suggesting that the translation of oil money into things like Masdar and Saudi Island is a good thing?
What I'm trying to do is first to understand that it's happening. So even if you look at Rockefeller Center here, the Rockefeller Center was built the moment that Standard Oil got into Caracas, Venezuelan oil. So you see often these iconic buildings arising when money is produced in different places, and it has nothing to do with the local economy in which they're actually produced. Architecture historians tend to discuss them, it's a very new style, it's a very new this, it's a very new that, but it's always very local, without taking into account that the possibility to make these happen was because of an event that happened elsewhere. So what I've been trying to do is to pair these local events, the Rockefeller Center, with what happened in Caracas at the same time. We talked briefly about oil-producing cities. There's all kinds of names of cities from Caracas is one of them. When oil in Venezuela came on, that's when Caracas was extremely transformed. We have several capitals around the world that were built, Dodoma is one of them, Abuja, because of oil money being directed into that location. Now, I'm not saying that it's a good thing how they're actually doing it. I think it's interesting to look at the comparison of Dubai and Abu Dhabi, where Abu Dhabi has invested way more into public spaces than Dubai has, that has concentrated on architectural landmarks. So there's other architectural comments that you can look at. Whether it's good or bad, that's the way they're doing it.
Although Dubai doesn't have oil and Abu Dhabi does.
Abu Dhabi has more than 95% of it, and it's funded by Abu Dhabi in the end anyway. But
this is something that I'm starting to think about is an underlying theme, and I don't want to be someone who gets hate mail after I say this, but we're continuing to pose oil as the villain. Mm-hmm. And it seems to me that that's one of the problems that we deal with whenever we're dealing with climate change, global warming, or energy, is that we want to deal with it morally, that it's a right or wrong, that it's a good or bad, that there's a hero and a villain. And are we preventing ourselves from really directly acting, reacting, and transacting with oil companies when we have painted them as the other, as the villain?
Go.
There's 12,500 hours of manual human labor in a barrel of oil. I mean, kind of everything that we have, we owe to it. It's not a bad thing. It's a miracle. Yeah. I think the question is now is more a kind of reconsideration. I mean, I think you're absolutely right. I hate to paint this in kind of like moral terms as well, but I would think of it more in terms of the different political commitments that people choose to take up with respect to things like oil companies. So yeah, they may not be, absolutely evil, but they can be villainous.
I can see this question, which comes up in a lot of ways. We should come back to. We have one last presentation by Ed.